and welcome to Zoom In on CGTN, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Jiao Yang. Today, we'll bring you a special program on the warming relations in the Middle East, coming up. As relations in the Middle East continue to thaw, we take a look at the reasons behind the breakthroughs, including China's role as a mediator in restoring Iran and Saudi Arabia's ties.
Two countries that hold significant influence beyond their own borders could usher in a new era right here in the Middle East.
Ties between Gulf Arab countries and Syria, Turkey and Iran are also seeing a revival following Iran and Saudi Arabia's reconciliation. Are these achievements sustainable? And we review the impact of the improving relations in the Middle East on the regional economy as well as the global. Once bitter rivals, Saudi Arabia and Iran are now seeking rapprochement. 7 years after severing diplomatic ties, the two countries will reopen embassies in each other's capitals within days. The two leading Sunni and Shia Muslim powers have been at odds for decades, but this March in Beijing, they agreed to put their grudge aside and restore relations, and that's a breakthrough that has impacted the entire Middle East. Let's take a closer look.
The spring of 2023 has not only seen the melting of the winter snow and ice, but also a defrosting of bitter divisions in the Middle East. On March the 10th, with China as a mediator, Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to restore diplomatic ties 7 years after severing relations in a breakthrough that took the world by surprise. A month later, foreign ministers of both countries were shaking hands in Beijing in a historic moment witnessed by Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang. They signed a joint agreement and announced the resumption of diplomatic ties with immediate effect. Now both sides are busy reopening embassies in each other's capitals. The move was followed by a wave of thawing ties between other countries in the Middle East. Just 1 week after Saudi Arabia and Iran re-established ties, Qatar and Bahrain announced an end to a long-running diplomatic feud, reinstating relations. Both sides voiced hopes to strengthen Gulf unity and integration. The breeze of the Middle East spring reached Yemen as well. On April the 9th, Saudi and Omani delegations held peace talks with Houthi officials in the Yemeni capital Sana'a. Yemen's Houthi group and its government conducted prisoner swaps, which also adds to hopes that Yemen's 9-year conflict can one day be settled. After restoring ties with Iran, Saudi Arabia has smoothed out relations with Syria. Both foreign ministers have broken the ice by visiting each other earlier this month. The Gulf Cooperation Council has discussed Syria's possible return to the Arab fold. Syrian President Bashar Assad visited the United Arab Emirates, a sign that Syria is trying to mend ties with other Arab countries. Relations between Turkey and Egypt have also improved. The two nations are preparing to establish embassies following talks between the two foreign ministers.
Saudi Arabia and Iran's standoff has shaped events across the Middle East for more than 40 years. Now, many are saying that the recent diplomatic breakthrough could have a positive effect on conflict and disputes in the region. Jim Stenman has more.
Two bitter rivals reaching a historic deal back in March.
The China-brokered agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two countries that hold significant influence beyond their own borders, could usher in a new era right here in the Middle East.
So we shifted from confrontation to engagement, and that takes a lot of efforts.
The deal has coincided with ongoing efforts to end Yemen's almost decade-long civil war, where Saudi Arabia and Iran have found themselves backing opposite sides, and the regional reintegration of Syria's president after his country's own brutal civil war.
Saudi Arabia is looking for an exit strategy out of Yemen. Iran can play a role in that.
And there's hope these efforts could pay off sooner rather than later, especially after recent meetings between Houthi and Saudi leaders, as well as a prisoner exchange of nearly 900.
Both the Iranians and the Saudis, along with the Chinese, want a goal that is stable. What that means, that means you have to find a solution to the pending issues that you have.
But one regional player that risks being left out in the cold is Israel, at a time of significant protests at home over judicial overhaul.
The Israelis are going to have to look for other facets of a relationship with existing and potential Arab partners beyond simply having kind of an anti-Iran platform.
Concerns over Iran's regional proxies may have paved the way for the Abraham Accords, which saw Israel establishing relations with countries such as the UAE and Bahrain. These worries may eventually fade away. There is also a sense that many Arab countries don't believe Israel is even interested in peace with the Palestinians, perhaps especially under its current right-wing government.
The Saudis now could say, well, if you want a normalization, this is what we want. That the Israelis recognize Palestine as a state equal to them with the 1967 border. So all that sort of could be on the table.
As things stand, the ultimate beneficiary of recent geopolitical shifts is likely to be that of Tehran, as improved relations with Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries could offer the regime economic investment and strengthen its hand in negotiations to revive the Iran nuclear deal, which could ultimately ensure its own survival. Jim Stenman, CGTN, Dubai.
We're now joined by Abbas Aslani, Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Aslani. We're glad to have you on the show. So if you could talk us first through the process of Iran and Saudi Arabia re-establishing their ties. How did China get involved in this, and why was it such a successful mediator, especially compared to earlier talks that were held by Iraq in the past few years?
Well, Iran and Saudi Arabian negotiations started in Iraq, and Baghdad hosted several rounds of negotiations. There were also talks in Muscat. Oman is also contributing to the process, but the process somehow stopped at the political level because there were some developments in Iraq and the government changed in Baghdad, and we had a pause in that, let's say, process. Later on, there were also, some difficulties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran was blaming Saudi Arabia for provoking the protests in the country. But in the end, we saw that China mediated between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And because of the fact that Beijing had good relations with both Tehran and Riyadh, I think it was able to somehow mediate between the two countries in order to, clinch an agreement between the two sides. And I can say that the role that China played was very crucial and very critical in, let's say, helping the both sides in order to reach an agreement.
What would you say is the motivation for Riyadh to restore ties with Tehran, dropping such long-standing hostilities? How does Tehran view this? All right, well, we've lost our expert for now, but we'll get our guest back a little bit later. In the meantime, let's move on. The United States has cautiously welcomed the China-brokered Saudi-Iran deal, describing it as a good thing after decades of dominance in the Middle East. The country may now find itself losing influence over its Gulf allies. So is Washington now on the sidelines of a new regional order? Let's find out from my colleague Asir Namdar in Washington, D.C.
The Middle East has long been an important region in the geopolitical picture. It has been a priority in U.S. foreign policy for decades. But the landscape could be shifting a bit as more countries strengthen their ties in the Middle East. Nathan King has details.
It was the fist bump seen around the world. US President Joe Biden reversing his policy of isolating Saudi Arabia to travel to Jeddah last year for face-to-face talks with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The need to lower oil prices to combat rampant inflation outweighed human rights concerns. But there was also another factor to the Biden visit, a perceived decline in US influence in the region.
It is only becoming clear to me that how closely interwoven America's interests are with the successes of the Middle East. We will not walk away and leave a vacuum to be filled by China, Russia, or Iran. We'll seek to build on this moment with active, principled American leadership.
But that leadership has produced few visible results. Saudi Arabia has not increased oil production. Instead, along with other OPEC members, it's moved to tighten oil supply, frustrating the White House. Biden also campaigned on restoring the Iran nuclear deal abandoned by his predecessor, Donald Trump. So far, that has not happened, despite months and months of negotiations. At the same time, relations with Washington's closest ally in the Middle East, Israel, are severely strained as the Israeli government tries to push through controversial judicial reforms and increases confrontation with the Palestinians.
We're urging all sides now to take urgent steps to restore calm, to de-escalate. We want to make sure that there's an environment in which we can, I hope, at some point create the conditions where we can start to restore a sense of security for Israelis and Palestinians alike, which of course is sorely lacking.
In this volatile environment, it was therefore an apparent surprise to Washington to see a Chinese-sponsored rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran last month. The agreement could help solve the long-running conflict in Yemen and decrease tensions in the region more widely, something the US could not do due to its decades-long hostility towards Tehran. The US is on the sidelines too with regard to Syria, as many Arab nations move to re-establish ties with the Syrian government in a bid to end the long-running civil war and rebuild the country. And then there's the latest crisis in Sudan. While the US has been heavily involved in brokering a post-Omar al-Bashir transition towards democracy in Khartoum, the recent violence took many in Washington by surprise, prompting the US, along with other nations, to hurriedly evacuate diplomatic staff from the country. Many US citizens remain stranded. While the US still has a very powerful voice in the Middle East, it's increasingly becoming clearer that it is not the only voice in the region. Nations like China are focusing more on bringing countries together and development. It's also a new generation of leaders themselves from the region, a younger generation that is trying to move forward into a new development stage for a traditionally volatile region. Nathan King, CGTN, just outside the White House.
Let's turn to Saeed Khan. He's an associate professor of Near Eastern Studies at Wayne State University. Professor, welcome to the program. I want to pick up where Nathan left off, with China playing obviously a significant role with Iran and Saudi Arabia restoring ties. If you could perhaps expand a little bit more on what this really means for countries affected by this conflict between these two countries, the proxy wars, if you will, in Yemen, also in Syria.
Well, I think what we find now is what is sometimes regarded as Pax Americana, really falling into a decline and perhaps really coming to an end in the Middle East, something that the United States had really enjoyed having a monopoly, if you will, in the years after World War II, after the British and the French made their way out of their various occupation forces in the region. It really was the United States that came in and was able to then also deter other forces from being in the area. This is a brand new world now, and we find that between multilateralism and a very much a decline in the trust dividend that many parties, including allies of the United States, have in the region, there's a tremendous opportunity for not only a recalibration and a reconfiguration of the Middle East, but as you rightly said, a new chance for peace to come in, with a lot of the proxy wars disappearing thanks to new diplomatic initiatives. That's creating a new sense of confidence and a new rapprochement among many of the regional players. The fact, as you said, that Bashar al-Assad is now being welcomed back into the Arab fold is momentous. And then, of course, top of the table here, the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia normalizing after at least 40 years of tension, something that will certainly play over in a very cautious ceasefire that we have in places like Yemen.
So what does this mean for the United States and its role in the region, its really global influence moving forward?
The United States had enjoyed a monopoly in the region. That is no longer the case, with particularly China and Russia having unprecedented presence, visibility, and influence in the region, as well as credibility. And the other is the opportunity that we find many of these regional partners, as well as other forces, recognizing that the American formula is no longer the only one that needs to be followed. And as a result of it, we see many different countries willing to take a chance and looking at Beijing and looking at Moscow, partly because the relative baggage they feel is not very high. Also, the kinds of benefits that come with it. After all, you have a major oil producing area, but you have other oil producing states like Russia, with whom they have much more in common than with the United States. The shifting of security guarantees from what had been seen as the only option with the United States is also another game changer. For 90 years or so, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had essentially a relationship of oil for security, and now we find that those security guarantees are being vouchsafed by other countries like China and Russia.
So, Professor, how do you think Israel is looking at all this? Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's been on a crusade to isolate Iran, does it set back Israel's attempts to normalize its own relationship with Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think that Israel and the United States were both blindsided by the kind of détente that was brokered by China between Tehran and Riyadh. As you rightly said, Prime Minister Netanyahu was banking on two things for his at least foreign policy political career. One was more pressure on Iran, perhaps even, as many prognosticators seem to indicate, an attack on Iran. That is off the table right now because, of course, there's another superpower that is involved that will be much more protective of its diplomatic and other assets in the region. The other issue, of course, is trying to expand the so-called Abraham Accords beyond the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and bringing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on board. There was a lot of speculation that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince and future King of Saudi Arabia, was very receptive to the idea of normalizing relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That now seems to be a far more elusive concept. The fact that Saudi Arabia doesn't really need to join the Abraham Accords, the fact that China has become such a pivotal position player in the region, must be causing Netanyahu, on the one hand, a lot of anxiety. But I think it's also important to recognize that Israel acknowledges the rise of other powers in the region to the expense of the United States. After all, Netanyahu has been very close with Putin. One of the reasons why Israel has been neutral relatively in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, as well as, at least for the last several years, Israeli hopes to forge better ties with China when it comes to the transfer of technology, particularly in the defense sector.
And I have to ask you about Israel and Palestine. Looking ahead, can you see China playing a constructive role in being a peacemaker again? What are the challenges there? And are you optimistic? Can Beijing do what basically no one before them has done successfully?
I think for those people who are seeking a peaceful solution, one that will be sustainable, is certainly then welcoming Beijing's earnest efforts in this. The bigger question, though, is who is going to be opposed to it. I think it would be fair to say that the United States would certainly be rather prickly about the idea that what had been really its exclusive domain on the issue of Israel-Palestine was now being usurped by someone else, and then also wondering what that would mean for increased Chinese influence, whether it is with Israel, whether it is with an independent Palestinian state, or if the negotiations create a one-state solution, what will that then mean for the trust dividend, the peace dividend, and the economic dividend that would certainly come out of it?
All right, we'll leave it there. Professor Saeed Khan, thank you. And that is it for us here in Washington. Let's send it back to our colleagues in Beijing.
And that's Asiya Namdai in Washington, D.C. for us. Well, we're picking up the coverage now, and we managed to get our guest, Abbas Aslani, back online. Mr. Aslani, so we were just talking about the motivation for Riyadh in re-establishing ties with Tehran and dropping these decades of hostility. How does Tehran see this?
Well, it seems that both countries to get to understand that the decades of, let's say, tensions and rivalry between the two capitals have not limited the sphere of influence of both countries in the region. One of the most important cases in the region that is somehow pushing the two countries in order to reach an agreement was to end the conflict in Yemen. And it seems the war in the country has reached an equilibrium where both parties, meaning the Saudis and Yemenis, they think that it's now time to end the conflict. Iran also can make an impact in contributing to the process, in convincing the both sides in order to reach, let's say, the agreement. And in the past couple of weeks, we have been seeing that there have been, let's say, peace talks in Oman as well as in Yemen. There have been good results. So one of the most important factors seem to be the case of Yemen. On the other side, Saudi Arabia has a vision for development for 2030. So in order to achieve that, let's say, target, they need to establish stability and tranquility in order to absorb and attract, let's say, investment in the country. So in order to avoid the challenges, I think they need to, and they thought that they needed to have an agreement with Iran. That's, I think, one of the important cases and the reasons to push the Saudis for an agreement with Iran.
So what could Iran look to get from this deal, and what concessions does it have to make?
Well, for Iran on the other side, also the country, you know, has been specifically under the current government, the slogan of further cooperation and engagement with the neighboring countries, including the, let's say, those in the region. And this is exactly in line with what the current government has said. On the other side, at the time that the negotiations on the revival of the nuclear deal have not succeeded, it seems that Tehran is exploring alternative options, and one of the, let's say, solutions have been to work further with Asian and regional countries. So the agreement with Saudi Arabia is in line with that, let's say, policy, because at the time that Tehran has been under enormous economic pressure, so it is looking to further work with other, let's say, countries in the region in order to avoid isolation. And it seems that the further cooperation with neighboring countries also can undermine and weaken the normalization process that some Arab countries have started in the region with Israel. So it seems that, you know, Tehran and Riyadh both have somehow understood that, you know, tensions will not benefit either side. And if they want to have a stable region, they have to cooperate. This can benefit the region as well as some other countries, including China as well.
Well, thank you so much for your insights. Really appreciate it. Abbas Aslani, Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies. Thank you. Let's go to our correspondent Yasser Hakim now, who is in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. Hi, Yasser. So if you could bring us up to date first on the latest on Saudi and Iranian efforts to restore ties.
Yes, the preparations are ongoing now to reopen the Iranian embassy in Riyadh, and we understand it will be in a week's time, by most May the 9th, that will be reopened. There will be a meeting between the foreign ministers of both countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, expected in Riyadh as well before the opening of the embassy. Iran has sent an invitation for the King Salman to travel to visit Iran, an official invitation, and Iran said that it has received an invitation from King Salman for the Iranian President Raisi to visit Saudi Arabia, but there's no confirmation from the Saudi side yet about this invitation. But if anything, it shows that there is a closeness of ties between both sides, especially after the brokered peace deal by China. You know, there have been ongoing negotiations between both sides to try to restore relations. These negotiations were going on for years, and they were sponsored by Iraq, and they have met 5 times in Iraq, representatives from both sides. But when China interfered and stepped in and played its role, they managed to strike a deal in Beijing. So what we now are witnessing the final phases and the final preparations to put this into action. And we expect this to happen in Saudi Arabia during the next week. Back to you.
And Yasser, what's been the overall public sentiments and reactions to what is really quite a surprising development?
Yes, it came as a surprise for everyone, and a good one maybe for many, although there is skepticism about Iran because of its latest policies in the region, trying to have proxy wars in several areas like Yemen and Syria and Lebanon. But any agreement could really cause some kind of naturalization in the region to keep a situation a bit stabilized. It's a hot region with a lot of conflicts in many countries, and maybe Saudi Arabia and Iran now, when they are close together, using Saudi Arabia's recent leadership in the region, can actually play an important role in calming down tensions in various countries, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria as well. And obviously with China having a big role also lately, we've seen what happened in the China-Arab Summit and China-Saudi Summit last December in Riyadh. It was a big summit that not just led to the normal or usual economic and logistical cooperation, but there was also, for the first time, a military and defense cooperation between Saudi Arabia and China. And obviously Saudi Arabia being a big a leader in the region, with Egypt having a strong close military and defense and security ties with Saudi Arabia, will have a pivotal role also on the Iranian side, and also to make sure that this agreement would stand and would have its weight on the region. So there is kind of hope and optimism from people here in Saudi Arabia towards this, though, like I said, there is skepticism about the intentions of Iran, but only time and actions will show that Iran has changed its policies towards the countries in the Gulf region and the Middle East as a whole.
All right, thank you so much. Yasser Hakim in Jeddah for us.
A historic agreement in Beijing. Saudi Arabia and Iran promised to end years of hostility. As Riyadh and Tehran resume ties, the winds of change are blowing in the Middle East. Landmark talks to end the war in Yemen. A Saudi-Syria thaw is on the cards. The Middle East is undergoing a dramatic shift. Where will this new intensive diplomacy lead? And what will be the likely impact on the region and the world? Join us for a special broadcast with voices from the ground and in-depth analysis. Winds of Change, Middle East's new outlook on CGTN. See the difference.
The wave of unrest that swept the Arab world in 2011 divided the Middle East. And during the past 2 decades, Egypt and most Gulf Arab countries severed ties with Turkey, Syria, Qatar, and Iran. And countries in the Middle East supported different sides in the civil wars in Yemen, Syria, and Libya. But with diplomatic meetings resuming between these countries, it is promising stability in the region. Adel Al-Maroui reports from Cairo.
2023 saw diplomatic rifts between several Arab countries from one side and Turkey, Syria, and Iran resolved. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his foreign minister made trips to UAE, Oman, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Ties between Turkey and Arab nations too saw a revival on the foreign minister's level. And China brokered a diplomatic agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran that started to diffuse years of tension.
Syria's inclusion is an extremely important move. It signifies how Arabs moved on their own, without influences from powers like the USA. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, didn't start approaching Syria until the successful Chinese mediation efforts mended its ties with Iran. Close ties between Turkey and Egypt, Saudi Arabia and UAE could help in easing many regional crises. Cairo and Ankara, for instance, agreed to ease the Libyan crisis. Instead of moving on contradicting paths, they worked together to bring Libyans closer.
The resumption of ties between Arab countries and Syria, Turkey, and Iran is conditional, though. Their embassies have not yet reopened, as Arabs demand a clear national reconciliation plan from Damascus and guarantees from Ankara and Tehran that they won't meddle in Arab domestic affairs.
The resumption of ties will reflect positively on politics and the economy, but that must be bound to the diplomacy of non-interference in domestic affairs. If that is preserved, trade, tourism, and other economic sectors will flourish. The region could finally shift from rivalry between powerful nations in the region to a win-win phase. These are countries with huge populations and great industrial and economic potential once they decide to complement one another.
Another breakthrough in these ties is expected next month. The Arab League summit will be held in Saudi Arabia on May 19, during which leaders could vote for Syria to retake its seats in the organization.
Turkey, Syria, and Iran. These diplomatic healings took place within just a few weeks from one another. And as the Arab world was about to take a breath of relief because these diplomatic successes could pour stability into Yemen and Libya, Sudan breaks into an armed conflict to only keep fears of instability in this region alive. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Syrian President Bashar al-Assad met with China's special envoy to the Middle East in the capital Damascus on Saturday. They discussed bilateral relations and the current international situation. Special Envoy Jai Jun stressed China's support for the positive development of the rapprochement between Syria and the Arab nations. And Bashar al-Assad praised China's diplomacy, which led to the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. He affirmed that Syria will not forget China's support for its sovereignty and expressed his gratitude for China's humanitarian assistance in the aftermath of the February earthquake. After almost a decade of war in Yemen, direct talks between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia kicked off in Yemen's capital on the 8th of April. Mohammed Al-Kibsi reports from Sana'a on the early signs of progress.
Direct talks in Sana'a between Houthis and Saudi officials covered vital issues that could lead to an end to the war. They included a ceasefire extension, a prisoners of war swap, and the resumption of flights from Sana'a airport. The Saudi-led military coalition has also allowed the reopening of the Houthi-held port of Hodeidah for commercial ships.
Ongoing talks between Sana'a and Riyadh in a positive atmosphere can create a positive change that affects all citizens by alleviating humanitarian suffering by lifting the blockade. This positive atmosphere is brought about by the resumption of diplomatic relations between Tehran and Riyadh. This deal that happened under the leadership of China inspired a new economic vision in the Middle East, which could disrupt the American hegemony in the region.
On April 14 through 16, the two parties smoothly implemented a prisoner swap deal by exchanging some 900 prisoners, marking a positive step for success in solving other problematic issues. The Saudi delegation left Sana'a for consultations with officials in Riyadh, hoping to resume talks after the Eid vacation.
If the war stopped, the country would improve and employees could receive their salaries. I would be able to rent a better house and prices would gradually improve. Currently, gas, food, fuel, and rent are all expensive.
It's estimated that 4 million people have been displaced, tens of thousands killed, and the majority of the country forced to rely on humanitarian aid. The United Nations has described the situation in Yemen as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world.
Firstly, we are expecting good things. Secondly, the salaries of people will be released so they can feed their children. They haven't gotten their salaries for 8 years. Then we won't need aid from any country.
If they reopen Hodeidah seaport, certainly prices will change and transportation costs will change, and people's lives will change for the better.
No doubt the resumption of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by China, has had positive effects, putting Saudi Arabia and the Houthis on the path for ending their extended war and alleviating the suffering of the Yemeni people. Mohammed Al-Kibsi, CGTN, Sana'a.
A dose of cautious optimism as Yemen's peace negotiations to end the war pick up pace. But how did Yemen slide into conflict? Well, my colleague Zhou Jiaxin joins me now in the studio with more on this. Jiaxin, it's over to you.
Yes, Joanne. So in 2011, the Arab Spring protests undermined then-President Ali Abdel Saleh's two-decade-long rule. The Saudi Arabia-led Gulf Cooperation Council in 2012 oversaw negotiations to force Saleh out and put Vice President Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi in charge. By 2014, some factions rebelled against the new government. One was the Houthis, a Shia Muslim minority from northern Yemen. The Iran-aligned Houthis seized the capital Sana'a in September 2014 with the help of Saleh. Hadi fled to Saudi Arabia, who led a coalition with other countries in an attempt to get the president back in power and curb the influence of Iran. Rights groups accused the coalition of bombing public facilities and killing civilians, but Western support for the military campaign continues. The Houthis also fired a great number of missiles deep into Saudi Arabia. In 2018, peace talks in Sweden agreed to a truce and prisoner swap. Violence continued. In 2019, Riyadh brokered a power-sharing deal between the Houthis and Hadi's government, and President Hadi ceded power 3 years later. In 2020, the Saudi-led coalition also announced a truce due to COVID-19, but no permanent ceasefire really happened. And this March, China brokered the restoration of Saudi-Iran diplomatic ties, raising hopes the Yemen peace could finally happen. And sources say fresh negotiations between the Yemen government and Houthis are now expected. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Jiaxin. Well, let's get some more analysis on all the latest developments in the region. And we're joined by Wang Jin, Associate Professor at the Northwest University of China, and Middle East Analyst, Dr. Mir Javed-Anfar. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. Professor Wang, if we can start with you. So the conflict of Yemen is in some ways a spillover of the Iran-Saudi conflict. So now that these two powers are reconciling, is this the chance for lasting peace?
Yes, I think it is a very important chance for the peace inside Yemen, because we know on the one hand, Saudi Arabia and Iran, they are very important players in the Yemen civil war, because especially the Saudi Arabia, they actually directly involved into the warfare inside Yemen. So once these two countries, they could pacify the tension, they could bridge the opportunity of a peace with each other. It means that they might talk about the peace prospect in Yemen, and they will create the opportunities of peace for the Yemenis people. So it means a new opportunity for them. And meanwhile, the rapprochement between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, they actually create the kind of atmosphere of peace and stability through dialogue, not war, in the Yemen, in the Middle East. So it means a kind of the new air, and a kind of the new regional atmosphere for all the nations in the Middle East. So especially including Yemen. So it means also new sense of opportunities of peace and stability through political dialogues rather than war and conflicts in Yemen and in the region. So I think it means opportunities for peace for the Yemenis people and opportunities for peace for Yemen's future.
Dr. Javed-Anfar, so it's definitely good news for Yemen, but how do you think this reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia will affect other countries in the Middle East? Can we expect more diplomatic thaws in the future?
Well, it really depends. This was unexpected. I think this development was unexpected. I think the Iranians and the Saudis both are going to take a very cautious approach, especially the Saudis. They're going to take it step by step in terms of seeing whether the reopening of embassies is going to really lead to the cessation of the war in Yemen, whether the Saudis and the Iranians can reach agreements over what's happening in Syria, over issues in Lebanon and in Iraq. But of course, these are further down the horizon, further down the line. But I think for now, I think both sides are cautiously optimistic. And I think what happened between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I think this could provide China with another opportunity for Foreign Minister Xi Jinping, to try and see whether he can bring Israel and Iran, reduce tensions between each other. I think China can play the role of a mediator. I'm not expecting peace between Iran and Israel as much as I'd like to see that happen. But
So
I think China could play
actually,
an important role as a mediator to
on that, you mentioned Israel there, Dr. Javed Namfar. So how does Israel view this development between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Because I know Israel was hoping to bring Saudi Arabia on board with the Abraham Accords, but we were very clear on what Iran's stance is on Israel.
Sure. Look, without a shadow of a doubt, this was a setback for Israel, although Israel was not the biggest reason why the Saudis decided to improve relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. It is a setback, but it's not a huge setback because the Iranians are continuing to support Russia in the war in Ukraine, and this has led to a severe situation of isolation for Iran. They're sidelined more than ever before. So, this means that the new rapprochement with Saudi Arabia is not going to have a massive effect. Also, the Saudis cannot invest in Iran because Iran is under sanctions and Iran is blacklisted by the Financial Affairs Task Force, but Financial Action Task Force. But yes, it is at the micro level, tactical level. Yes, this is a setback, without a shadow of a doubt, setback for Israel. But at a macro level, for now, it's not going to change the situation of the region entirely against Israel. And it's also possible that in the future Saudi Arabia will also be improving relations with Israel, that we can't write that off either.
Absolutely. So Syria, the other big development there. So we understand that on Monday, Arab League foreign ministers will be meeting in Jordan to discuss whether to bring Syria back on board with the Arab League, bring it back into the fold. Professor Wang, do you think there's a big likelihood that this will happen for Syria?
I think it suggests the kind of the trend that Syria will go back to the family of Arab League, because Arab League actually, on the one hand, it represents the very political unity of Arab states, and on the other hand, it suggests that the attitudes of Arab world towards the Syria civil war or Syria problem. So once the Syrian government, once the kind of the solution was made, be made that the Syrian government would go back to the Arab League, it means that Arab League and Arab world, they hope to, on the one hand, accept the Syria's membership again, while on the other hand, will hope to accept the status quo right now. What is happening here in Syria will be settled, will be pave the way for the new opportunities of peace in Syria. But again, as we always stress, that there were still some obstacles, especially on the one hand, there were some states, for example, Qatar. I don't think they will welcome this kind of the solution. They might have their own opinion or their own disagreements. And on the other hand, there were some problem, especially inside Syria. There was the hostilities between Syrian government and the Syrian opposition groups are still there. The divisions are still very apparent. So I don't think the way for the Syrian go back to the Arab League will be very smooth. Will be very easy. But as we stress, this is the trend because with more and more the Arab states, they hope to accept that Syria go back to the Arab League. I think this will happen one day in the future.
Professor Wang, so these deep divisions, they still do exist for the region as a whole as well, and there's vying strategic interests here still existing between the states. If these deep divergences can't be resolved, how can these diplomatic achievements still be sustained in the long run?
Of course, because as you mentioned, there were still a lot of the divisions, especially the ideology divisions, not ideological divisions, or the social divisions, social opinion divisions. They are still there. So what we are talking about that although against this kind of the difficulties and divisions, that the diplomatic ties should still be renewed, because every country they have. When we talk about the diplomatic ties, every two countries or every bilateral relations, there will always be divisions. There will always be misunderstandings. There will always be problems. So that does not necessarily mean that this kind of the obstacles and difficulties will prevent the normal ties between every bilateral relations. So this is why we're talking about China's contribution to this to the peace process between Saudi Arabia and Iran is very important, because we bring them together. We make a bridge for their divisions to melt down, to narrow. So I think that is why we call this the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia is very important, because there will still be, of course, there will be a division in the future there, but the opportunities of peace is very important.
Just quickly there, Professor Wang, just very quickly on China's diplomacy here, what sway do you think it had with Saudi Arabia and Iran to achieve a success, in an area where others have failed?
Because China's very truthful move. On the one hand, we respect the sovereignty and independence of the two countries, and like we respect our respect to every regional country. And on the other hand, China's image of peace, development, and the good willingness has been widely accepted by the regional countries. So that is why I think China can do this, while the other countries, maybe they have made their efforts, but they failed.
And Dr. Javed Anfar, one last question for you. So this wave of diplomacy, coming in the current global situation we're seeing here with all kinds of conflicts, what sort of ripple effects do you think it will bring internationally beyond the region?
Well, I think certainly this is a diplomatic win for China. I think this is going to strengthen China's political weight in this region as a mediator. Which is why I made the suggestion that perhaps China can play a role in mediating between Iran and Israel in order to reduce tensions, to play the role of a go-between. But if we assess the situation globally, I think the world is much more preoccupied with the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, and tensions between China and Taiwan. These are the issues that are attracting much more attention, taking away much of the focus of the international community. The Middle East, for now, is actually being pushed into a corner. We are, for the first time, marginalized in the international media, which is actually not a bad thing. But overall, I'd have to say that in this region, right now, our biggest concerns are not only political and military, but also environmental. This region is facing its strongest drought in recent history, which has made people homeless, and it's going to continue, and it's going to actually pose further threats to this region. So when it comes to addressing Middle Eastern concerns, as well as economy and security, we should also look at the environmental concerns of this region, because they're going to play a big part.
All right, thank you so much, and absolutely, and this is drawing attention to the fact that there is more than just one conflict going on in the world right now. But thank you so much, Professor Wang Jin with Northwest University of China and Dr. Mir Javed Anfar, Middle East analyst. Now, in Turkey, with parliamentary and presidential elections scheduled for May 14th, the country is working towards reconciling with countries in the region, particularly Egypt. And analysts suggest that Turkey's goal of becoming a regional power is a significant driving force behind these efforts. Mahal Bardavit reports.
For the past year, Turkey has been speeding up efforts of rapprochement with several countries in the region and has taken steps to improve ties with Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and even Syria.
Turkey's regional role has now been accompanied by a global role. Turkey is trying to play a certain role, one of which is a stabilizing position. In order to support this, it is necessary for Turkey to reach a certain level of relationship with the countries that it has conflicts with. This is the primary issue.
In this regard, Ankara has been pushing to normalize diplomatic relations with Cairo. The foreign ministers of both countries have hosted each other in their respective countries this year. Turkey and Egypt have both shown interest in mending ties after a decade of estrangement, which began after the ousting of Egypt's former president Mohamed Morsi in 2013, a close ally of Turkey. One of the main topics of conflict had been Libya. Following a meeting in Ankara in April, the foreign ministers jointly announced a common interest for fair elections to be held in Libya. Normalizing ties could create significant opportunities for both Turkey and Egypt, particularly in the area of energy cooperation. In 2020, Turkey signed a maritime agreement with Libya. However, in previous years, Ankara has suggested a potential agreement on the delimitation of borders in the eastern Mediterranean between Turkey and Egypt could have substantial benefits for both countries.
The second issue is energy security. In this respect, it is necessary to manage the process in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean well in order to ensure the energy security of European countries in this region.
Boosting ties with Egypt could also support Turkey's struggling economy, which took another hit during the massive earthquakes on February 6th. In 2022, the trade volume between the two countries reached a record level of $7.7 billion. As Turkey is heading to parliamentary and presidential elections in less than 3 weeks on May 14th, analysts stress that a normalization of ties with Egypt could also be perceived as a political win for the ruling AK Party and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Michal Bardavid, CGTN, Istanbul.
Let's now bring in John Gong, live from Tel Aviv. He's the Vice President of Research and Strategy at the University of International Business and Economics in Israel. John, it's great to have you on the show. So first of all, this trend in the Middle East, do you think this means that the region is possibly focusing more on economic needs, economic developments, over politics?
Well, economic development is one of the factors driving this, but I think more importantly, it is really because of the balance of power adjustment. I think there's a profound change as a result of United States responses to a series of attacks, on Saudi, as well as what's happening on the battleground in Yemen. These developments, probably make the Saudis convinced that the United States probably is not able to provide a kind of security commitment they used to. And in light of this, also in light of the macro development around the globe in terms of geopolitics, I think the Arab side, particularly the Saudis, have come to realize that a great rapprochement with the Shiite political forces in the region is probably in their interest, and certainly the other side thinks the same thing. So I think the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia is really fundamental in terms of driving other reconsiderations among other countries on both camps, as we are seeing between Bahrain and Qatar and Turkey and Egypt and a couple of other relationships. This is, I think it's a great moment for the Middle East in terms of peace and stability in the region.
Do you think we'll see a closer relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran in oil cooperation, and also, apart from that, any other potential cooperation areas between the two nations?
Yeah, well, I think both countries are major oil-producing countries, and of course, it would be in their interest to maintain a price stability of oil. And I think even before this rapprochement, I think the Saudi-led OPEC, well, I should say OPEC Plus, is already in ways tacitly cooperating with Iran in terms of maintaining oil price. So I think given that they've already established diplomatic relations, given that they're going to set up embassies in each country, I think it's going to be more likely that both countries will come together, to maintain oil price. This is just fundamental economics. There's money we're talking about. It's something in their self-interest to do that.
So, John, do you see this thaw as a lasting one of warming of relations across the Middle East? And how does anyone go about guaranteeing that these promises will be kept and the deals will be kept?
You raised an interesting and very important question. Now, if you look at the history of Middle East politics, I guess it's noted for its being quite fickle, I would say. So God knows how long the current situation is going to last. But I think at least for the time being, it appears that there's a quite bit of a hope of peace in this region. It looks like the truce in Yemen is going to last, and hopefully the war is going to end. And I think in terms of the Middle East peace process, but more importantly, I think is what's happening here in Israel. The peace process between the Palestinians and the Israelis is really the litmus test of the question whether peace is going to last in this region. And in that regard, we have seen China's willingness to at least facilitate that peace process. A few days ago, Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang respectively made phone calls with his counterparts in Israel and Palestinian side, expressing the interest and willingness to sponsor peace talk in Beijing. And that's a major, major development in my view, against the context of Washington playing that kind of a role for decades, but leading to very limited results. And hopefully, I think Beijing's involvement will lead to something.
And hopefully that is not just fleeting peace. Well, thank you so much for your insights, John Gong, in Tel Aviv for us, Vice President of Research and Strategy at the University of International Business and Economics for Israel. Well, just as the geopolitical map of the Middle East, its alliances and rivalries, wars and peace were not drawn over a day, we cannot begin to cover all its complexities in just an hour. And we've merely scratched the surface of this intricate web of relationships. So there are rivals who share mutual adversaries, allies who back opposing sides in a conflict, common contradictory interests which all shape the direction of the region. But for now, all signs do seem to suggest that this path is a pragmatic one towards setting aside differences for more sustainable economic, social gains. And as we heard, that there need not be just one voice dictating the order in the region. So some might view the region as a zero-sum game. A gain for one is a loss for another, but many will agree that a secure and stable region does bring benefits for more. So the question remains, is this a lasting warming of relations or a brief freezing of hostilities? Well, we'll certainly be watching. So thank you so much for watching our special edition of Zoom In. I'm Jiao Yang in Beijing from the team. Bye for now.